It was supposed to be a typical solo camping trip. I've always preferred the solitude of the woods, the peace that comes from being surrounded by towering trees and the scent of fresh pine. I'm not new to the outdoors, far from it. I've hiked, camped, and explored more remote areas than I can count. So when I decided to venture into the Pacific Northwest for a week-long solo trek, I thought I knew what to expect. I set out from a tiny, fading town, far beyond the usual trailheads where most hikers go. The kind of place where the locals keep their heads down and rarely engage with outsiders. It was already late in the afternoon when I arrived at the start of the trail, the sun dipping low behind the thick canopy of trees. I hadn't been on this particular trail before, but I'd studied my map and felt confident it would lead me through some untouched wilderness. The kind of untouched wilderness that most people never get to experience. The trail was narrow and rugged, barely visible in some places, and I had to push my way through the underbrush. The dense forest swallowed the light, turning the late afternoon into an early dusk. But I didn't mind. It felt good to be so far from civilization, with only the sounds of my footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves for company. By the time the sun had fully set, I had reached a small clearing near a stream, a perfect spot to set up camp. I built a fire, boiled some water, and cooked a simple meal. As the flames danced in the growing darkness, the night air cooled rapidly, and the forest grew still, almost too still. First, I brushed it off. Nature can be quiet at night, but this silence, it felt different, too heavy. I've always had a bit of an uneasy feeling when camping in unfamiliar territory, but tonight, the woods felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. I sat by the fire, poking at the embers, trying to shake the feeling. That's when I heard it. A rustle. At first, it was soft, like the wind moving through the trees. But then it grew louder, sharper, definite steps moving closer. It wasn't the shuffle of an animal, not the way a deer or a bear moves. This was purposeful, deliberate. I stood up slowly, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound, my hand instinctively reaching for my flashlight. I swept it across the darkness, my heart starting to pound. The beam landed on nothing but trees and shadows. But I felt it. Something was watching me from the edges of the clearing. "Hello," I called out, trying to sound confident, though my voice cracked slightly. I took a few cautious steps forward, the flashlight trembling in my hand. There was no reply, but the sound of something moving in the brush came again, this time closer. I froze, my stomach tightening. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe a curious deer or a raccoon, but I knew it wasn't either of those. The weight of the silence around me felt suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I took another step, my heart thudding against my ribs, and then there it was. At first, it was just a shadow, something that barely registered in the beam of my flashlight. But as I adjusted the light, I saw it more clearly. A hulking figure, just beyond the edge of the clearing, standing completely still. It was tall, far taller than any man I'd ever seen. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, dark as night. Its limbs were unnaturally long, twisted in ways that didn't seem right, and its fingers ended in jagged, claw-like nails. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move or even breathe properly. The thing didn't seem to notice me at first. It just stood there, motionless, as though it was part of the trees themselves. But then its head moved. Slowly, it turned toward me, and I saw its eyes. Those eyes, Jesus, those eyes. They were enormous, glowing faintly with an unnatural yellow hue. Hollow, yet somehow filled with a cold intelligence that chilled me to my core. It wasn't a creature that belonged to this world. It wasn't a predator or some wild animal. It was something ancient, something that had been here long before humans, long before civilization. I stumbled back, my breath shallow and quick. The creature didn't move. It just stared at me with those haunting eyes, as though it was sizing me up, determining whether or not I was worth its time. And then it made a sound, a low, rasping growl, more felt than heard. It vibrated through my chest, like a warning. The sound wasn't animalistic, it wasn't like a bear or a wolf. It was hollow, as if the very air around the creature was wrong. My feet were moving before I could even think. I turned and ran, not caring about the fire, not caring about anything except putting distance between myself and that thing. The forest blurred around me as I sprinted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every shadow seemed to twist and shift in the periphery of my vision, and the trees closed in like they were trying to trap me, to keep me there. I don't know how far I ran or for how long. I just ran. My legs burned, and my chest felt like it was going to explode, but I couldn't stop. The only thing that mattered was getting away. The only thing I could focus on was the sound of my feet hitting the ground and the taste of fear that filled my mouth. When I finally reached my tent, I didn't even hesitate. I bolted it shut, pulled on the zipper, and collapsed inside, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might rip right out of my chest. I could hear the night settling around me again, the usual sounds of the forest returning, but there was something wrong. The air was thick with that same strange stillness, like the world was holding its breath. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. I lay in the dark, listening for any sign of movement, but all I could hear was the sound of my own frantic breathing. By morning, I packed up and left in a hurry. I didn't bother with breakfast, didn't even take the time to clean up. I just grabbed my gear, shoved it into my backpack, and started hiking back the way I came. It wasn't until I reached the trailhead and saw the familiar outline of my car that I finally allowed myself to breathe again. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me from the trees. I haven't been back to that part of the woods, and truth be told, I don't think I ever will. I don't know what it was that I saw that night. I don't know if it was some kind of cryptid, some ancient beast that haunts these woods, or if it was something else entirely, something far older and far darker. But I know one thing for sure. There are things in the forest, things that are not meant to be found, and they are waiting. Waiting for someone like me to stumble into their territory. And next time, I might not be so lucky. It started out as a simple weekend getaway. Just me, my tent, and a few days of solitude in the wilderness. I'd been hiking for years, and after a long stretch of hectic city life, I needed the peace of the woods. This wasn't my first time venturing into the remote parts of the Rockies, but I'd never gone so far off the beaten path. I was heading into a part of the forest known to only a handful of locals, an area that, if you asked around, most people would say you shouldn't go alone. Of course, that made it all the more appealing to me. I rented a small cabin near a trailhead and spent the first day exploring. The forest felt untouched, ancient even, with trees so tall they seemed to disappear into the sky. The air was fresh, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. I hiked along the trail, keeping an eye out for wildlife, but it was eerily quiet. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the time of year, late autumn, when most animals are laying low, preparing for the coming winter. By the time I found a spot for camp, the sun was already beginning to set behind the mountain peaks. I set up my tent by a quiet stream, the sound of running water providing a calm backdrop. There were no other campers nearby, just me and the wilderness. I lit a small fire, roasted some food, and sat back to watch the embers flicker under the starry sky. But as night fell, that familiar stillness settled over the forest. Only it was different this time. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you expect in nature. It was a dead, heavy silence. Even the wind had stopped moving. The chill in the air seemed to creep up my spine, a sensation I couldn't shake. Every once in a while, I thought I heard something, a faint movement in the brush or a rustling of leaves, but each time, I would turn around and find nothing. I tried to ignore it. I had camped in the wild before, and I knew how the mind could play tricks on you in the dark. But that night, something felt off. I was sitting by the fire when I heard the first real noise. Something large, something heavy, breaking through the undergrowth on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a bear. The footsteps were too deliberate, too rhythmic. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in the direction of the sound. My heart skipped a beat as I caught a glimpse of something massive, moving just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it might be a moose or elk, something big, but not out of the ordinary. But then the thing shifted, and I saw it more clearly. It wasn't an animal at all. It was humanoid, standing on two legs, but the way it moved was wrong. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, dark as night, and it stood much taller than any man. Its arms hung long, too long, and the fingers on its hands were sharp, almost claw-like. Its head was misshapen, with an elongated jawline, and eyes that reflected the light of my flashlight, glowing faintly red. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I didn't know if I was seeing things, if my mind was playing tricks on me. But when the creature stepped forward, its footfalls heavy on the forest floor, I knew this wasn't just a trick of the light. I fumbled for my backpack, my fingers shaking as I grabbed my knife. My instincts told me to run, but something held me in place. The creature was still watching me, standing just out of reach of the light, hidden in the shadows. It wasn't moving, but I could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing in on me. It seemed to be studying me, sizing me up, and that's when I noticed the worst part. Its eyes weren't right. They weren't like an animal's eyes. They were empty, like there was nothing behind them, just an abyss staring back at me. I stood up slowly, heart pounding in my chest. My mind was screaming at me to flee, but my feet wouldn't move. It wasn't until the creature took a step closer, its breath heavy and deep, that I snapped out of it. My body kicked into gear, and I bolted into the trees, not even bothering to grab my gear or pack. I didn't look back. The forest was dense, and the ground was uneven, but I ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning. Every rustle in the trees sounded like it was following me. I could hear the thing's footsteps, heavy, purposeful, coming closer, getting louder. I didn't know what it was, but I didn't want to find out. I ran for what felt like hours, not stopping once. My legs were aching, and I couldn't catch my breath, but I didn't dare slow down. Every so often, I'd hear something moving just behind me, but when I turned around, there would be nothing. No creature, no figure lurking in the shadows. But the sound kept following, echoing through the trees like it was always just out of sight. When I finally stumbled back to the trailhead, completely out of breath and half crazy with fear, I couldn't even bring myself to look behind me. I had to get to my car. I didn't know what I'd seen out there. I didn't want to know. But as I reached my car, I stopped for a moment, frozen in place. I could still hear it, that heavy, deliberate sound of footsteps behind me, echoing through the trees. I didn't wait any longer. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove the hell out of there, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I never went back to that part of the forest. I tried to tell myself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the mind, but deep down I know better. Whatever that thing was, it was real, and it was waiting, watching. Some places in the wilderness, I've learned, are better left undisturbed. Because when you wander too far off the trail, sometimes you find things that weren't meant to be found. And they don't let you leave so easily.